The rain pounded mercilessly against the wooden auction platform as Lillian Rose clutched her thin shawl tightly around her shoulders, her knuckles white from the strain. She had been standing there for hours, her chestnut hair plastered against her pale face, her green eyes fixed on the auctioneer who seemed determined to drag out the proceedings until nightfall. It was April 1875, and the Colorado spring had betrayed everyone with an unexpected downpour that had scattered most of the townsfolk of Denver to nearby shelters, leaving only the desperate or determined to remain. Lillian was both. The Hawkins family farm, her childhood home, was being sold piece by piece, the livestock, the equipment, and finally, the land itself. Her father's debts had mounted after his passing 3 months prior, and at 22, Lillian found herself alone, facing the brutal reality of frontier economics. Her mother had succumbed to tuberculosis years earlier, and her younger brother had headed west to California, chasing gold dreams like so many others. Next up, the north parcel, 60 acres with creek access, the auctioneer called out, his voice competing with the drumming of rain on the platform's canvas roof. Starting bid at $200. Lillian shivered violently as water dripped from her sodden hem, creating a small puddle around her worn boots. She had sold her horse and cart just to be able to bid on the smallest parcel of land, the one containing the family cemetery, where her parents rested. But the bidding had already surpassed what little she had. From beneath the eaves of the general store, Samuel Prescott watched the forlorn figure on the auction grounds. The young woman had caught his attention when he'd ridden into town earlier that morning, not just because of her undeniable beauty, but because of the quiet dignity with which she endured both the elements and the pitying glances from townsfolk. Samuel was 30, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. He had built a modest cattle operation over the past 5 years after arriving in Colorado from Texas with little more than his horse, his skills, and an unwavering determination. He wasn't wealthy by Denver standards, but he was comfortable enough, and his reputation as a fair businessman and skilled horseman had earned him respect in the community. The auctioneer's voice rose again as he called for final bids on another parcel, and Samuel noticed the young woman's shoulders slump slightly before she straightened again, rainwater streaming down her face. Without fully understanding his own impulse, Samuel pushed away from the storefront and strode across the muddy street. As he approached, he shrugged off his heavy leather duster coat. "Madam," he said quietly, stepping onto the platform beside her, "you'll catch your death out here." Lillian turned, startled by the deep voice. Her eyes met his, and for a moment she seemed too surprised to speak as he gently draped the coat around her shoulders. It was warm from his body and smelled of leather, horses, and tobacco. "I don't need charity," she finally said, though her body betrayed her as she unconsciously pulled the coat tighter around herself. "It's not charity, madam," Samuel replied with a slight tip of his hat. "Just common decency. No one should have to stand in this weather without proper covering." The auctioneer's hammer came down hard. "Sold. To Mr. Henderson for $450. Lillian's eyes squeezed shut for a moment, and Samuel could see the pain etched across her features. "Another piece of her life gone. May I ask which parcel you're waiting for?" He inquired gently. She hesitated, then sighed. "The southeast corner, 10 acres with the family cemetery. Not that it matters now. The bidding has gone well beyond what I can afford." Samuel studied her face, noting the strength behind the vulnerability. "Miss Rose." "Lillian Rose," she replied, a hint of pride in her voice despite her circumstances. "Miss Rose, I'm Samuel Prescott. Most folks call me Sam." He extended his hand, which she reluctantly took. Her fingers were ice cold despite her attempt to appear unaffected by the weather. "Thank you for the coat, Mr. Prescott, but I can't accept. You can return it when the auction's done," he interrupted smoothly. "I'll be right over there." He nodded toward the shelter of the general store. Before she could protest further, the auctioneer called out the next item. The southeast parcel, 10 acres with improvements including a small orchard and family cemetery, starting bid at $100. Lillian's attention snapped back to the auction, her grip tightening on the railing in front of her. Samuel stepped back, watching as she raised her hand for the opening bid. "I have 100 from Miss Rose," the auctioneer called. "Do I hear 125? A man in the back raised his hand. 125 from Mr. Davis. Do I hear 150? Lillian hesitated, then raised her hand again, though Samuel could see the fear in her eyes. She was stretching beyond her means. 150 from Miss Rose. 175. Mr. Davis nodded, and the bidding continued, quickly surpassing $200. When it reached 250, Lillian's hand trembled as she raised it one final time, her eyes shining with unshed tears. 250 from Miss Rose. Do I hear 275? Samuel watched the desperate determination on her face. Without fully considering the consequences, he stepped forward. 300, he called clearly. Lillian's head whipped around, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. She'd thought he was being kind, but here he was, outbidding her for the last piece of her family heritage. The auctioneer pointed at Samuel. 300 from Mr. Prescott. Do I hear 325? Mr. Davis shook his head, and several tense moments passed. Going once, going twice. Sold to Mr. Prescott for $300. Lillian's face crumpled, though she fought to maintain her composure. She began to shrug off Samuel's coat, but he stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "Miss Rose, please," he said quietly, his voice for her ears only. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "I understand perfectly well, Mr. Prescott," she replied, her voice tight with emotion. "Congratulations on your purchase. Miss Rose," Samuel continued, undeterred. "I bought that land for you," her movement stilled, disbelief evident in her expression. "What did you say?" "I have no need for 10 acres with a family cemetery. I bought it to give to you." Lillian stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." Samuel shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "Because it matters to you and because I can afford to help. Sometimes that's reason enough." The auctioneer called for a brief recess as the rain intensified, and the few remaining attendees scattered for better shelter. Samuel gently guided Lillian toward the general store's porch, where they could talk more privately. "I can't possibly accept such charity," Lillian said once they were under cover, though her voice had lost some of its earlier edge. "Consider it a loan, then," Samuel suggested, leaning against a wooden post. "To be repaid when you're able, on whatever terms you find fair." Lillian studied him skeptically. "And what would prevent you from changing the terms once I'm in your debt? I've seen how men operate, Mr. Prescott." Samuel removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair, slightly damp from the rain. "I understand your caution, Miss Rose. In your position, I'd likely feel the same." He thought for a moment. "We could have Mr. Jenkins, the banker, draw up a proper agreement, whatever would make you comfortable." Lillian considered his words. The exhaustion of the past 3 months burying her father, discovering the extent of his debts, fighting to save something of her inheritance weighed heavily on her slender shoulders. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she asked again, more softly this time. Samuel looked out at the rain-soaked street, considering his answer. "My father lost our family ranch in Texas when I was 16. Gambling debts," he added with a grimace. "I watched my mother beg to keep just the small cabin where we'd lived, where my baby sister was buried out back." The men wouldn't hear of it. His eyes, when they met hers again, held an understanding that Lillian felt in her bones. "I couldn't help my mother then. Perhaps I can help you now." Something in his straightforward manner and the sincerity in his eyes made Lillian believe him. She nodded slowly. "A loan, then, with proper terms and documentation." Samuel smiled, a warm expression that transformed his weathered face. "Agreed. Shall we find Mr. Jenkins after the auction concludes?" For the first time that day, perhaps the first time in months, Lillian felt a small weight lift from her chest. "Yes," she agreed. "Thank you, Mr. Prescott." "Sam," he corrected gently. "Most folks just call me Sam." Lillian allowed herself a small smile. "Sam, then." The auctioneer called everyone back as the rain lessened to a steady drizzle. The remaining parcels of the Hawkins farm were sold quickly, mostly to neighboring farmers expanding their holdings. Throughout it all, Samuel remained beside Lillian, a steady presence as she watched the final pieces of her childhood change hands. When the auction finally concluded, Samuel accompanied Lillian to the bank, where Mr. Jenkins, though surprised by the unusual arrangement, agreed to draw up the necessary paperwork. Lillian would have full ownership of the 10 acres, with a 5-year repayment term at a modest interest rate that made Samuel uncomfortable, but that Lillian insisted upon. "Pride's about all I have left," she explained outside the bank as the afternoon faded into evening. "I need to know I earned this back fair and square." Samuel nodded, respecting her determination. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" he asked, noting the darkening sky and the fact that she'd made no mention of current lodgings. Lillian hesitated. "I've been staying with Mrs. Peterson, helping with her children in exchange for room and board. But she stopped, a flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "But you what?" Samuel prompted gently. "I told her I'd be leaving today. I thought I'd have my land back with the small cabin on it." She laughed mirthlessly. "Foolish optimism." Samuel considered for a moment. "The cabin's still yours, just under different terms than you expected. Why not go there tonight?" Lillian shook her head. "It's 3 miles outside town and I sold my horse last week. Besides, I haven't been back since." She swallowed hard. "Since we buried Father." Understanding dawned in Samuel's eyes. "I see. Well, there's the hotel or—" He hesitated, then continued. "My sister-in-law runs a boarding house on Pine Street. Clean, respectable, and she sometimes takes help with housekeeping in lieu of payment." Lillian looked up at him, wariness returning to her gaze. "Your sister-in-law, Margaret Prescott. My brother Thomas died 2 years ago, influenza. She's raised their 3 children alone while running the boarding house. She's good people, Miss Rose." After a moment's consideration, Lillian nodded. "I would appreciate an introduction, if it wouldn't be too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Samuel assured her, offering his arm. She hesitated before placing her hand lightly upon it, and they set off down Denver's muddy Main Street toward Pine. As they walked, Lillian realized she was still wearing his coat. "Your duster," she said, beginning to remove it. "Keep it until we reach Margaret's," Samuel said. "The rain may decide to return." In truth, the skies had cleared considerably, but Lillian was grateful for the warmth and protection the coat provided. It was far too large for her frame, nearly reaching her ankles, but there was something comforting about being enveloped in its weight and scent. Margaret Prescott proved to be a kind, no-nonsense woman in her early 30s with Samuel's blue eyes and a welcoming smile. After hearing a brief explanation, she immediately offered Lillian a small room on the 2nd floor of the tidy boarding house. "I could use help with breakfasts and turning the rooms," Margaret explained as she showed Lillian the space. "That would cover half your board and we can arrange payment for the rest once you're settled." How does that sound?" Lillian's throat tightened with unexpected emotion at the woman's kindness. "That sounds more than fair. Thank you, Mrs. Prescott." "Margaret, please," she insisted, patting Lillian's arm. "Any friend of Sam's is welcome here. Though I must say," she added with a meaningful glance at her brother-in-law, "he rarely brings young ladies to my doorstep." Samuel cleared his throat, the tips of his ears reddening slightly. "I should be going. I've got a long ride back to my place." "Nonsense," Margaret declared. "It's nearly dark, and your cabin is a good hour's ride. You'll stay in your usual room tonight." Samuel looked as if he might argue, then nodded. "Thank you, Margaret. I'd appreciate that." Lillian suddenly remembered the coat she still wore. She slipped it off and extended it toward Samuel. "Thank you for the loan, Mr. Prescott. For both loans," she added meaningfully. "Sam," he corrected again with a smile, taking the duster from her. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Lillian felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. "Sam," she repeated softly. "Thank you." Margaret glanced between them with poorly concealed interest before ushering Lillian further into the room. "I'll find you some dry clothes and have Mary draw a hot bath. You must be chilled to the bone after standing in that dreadful rain all day." As Margaret bustled about making arrangements, Lillian glanced back to find Samuel still standing in the doorway, his expression thoughtful as he watched her. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod before turning to leave. That night, after the first hot bath she'd enjoyed in weeks and wearing a borrowed nightgown of soft cotton, Lillian lay in the narrow but comfortable bed, listening to the occasional sounds of the boarding house settling for the night. Her mind replayed the extraordinary events of the day, the despair of watching her family's land sold piece by piece, the unexpected kindness of a stranger, and the strange sense of connection she'd felt with Samuel Prescott. In the room down the hall, Samuel also lay awake, wondering what had possessed him to involve himself so thoroughly in the affairs of a woman he'd only just met. There had been something compelling about Lillian Rose from the moment he'd spotted her standing proud and alone in the pouring rain. Something that had reached past his carefully maintained reserve and touched a part of himself he'd long kept guarded. Neither of them could have predicted how their lives would intertwine in the months to come, or how the simple act of offering a coat in a rainstorm would change both their destinies forever. The following morning dawned clear and bright, as if the previous day's downpour had never happened. Lillian rose early, determined to prove her worth to Margaret by helping with breakfast preparations. She found the kitchen already bustling with activity as Margaret directed a young girl of about 12 in setting the long dining table. "Good morning," Margaret greeted warmly. "This is my daughter, Elena. Ellie, this is Miss Rose." "Lillian, please," she insisted, smiling at the girl who had her mother's blue eyes and blonde hair. "Are you Mr. Sam's sweetheart?" Elena asked bluntly, earning a sharp "Elena" from her mother. Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks. "No, I only met your uncle yesterday. He was kind enough to help me during the auction." Margaret handed Lillian an apron. "Sam mentioned you might be able to make biscuits. Mine are always too dense, according to certain ungrateful boarders." Grateful for the change of subject, Lillian tied the apron around her waist. "My mother taught me her recipe. I'd be happy to make them." As Lillian worked the dough, she asked, "Is Sam still here?" "He left at first light," Margaret replied, cracking eggs into a large bowl. "Said he had business at the land office and then needed to get back to his ranch. His foreman can handle things for a day or two, but Sam's not one to leave his responsibilities for long." Lillian tried to ignore the small pang of disappointment she felt. "Of course. He mentioned he has cattle." Margaret nodded. A modest spread about an hour's ride northwest of Denver. He started with almost nothing 5 years ago. Now he has a good herd, a decent cabin, and about 5 hired hands. Pride was evident in her voice. Sam's worked hard for everything he has. He said you've been alone for 2 years, Lillian ventured carefully. I'm very sorry about your husband. Margaret's hand stilled briefly. Thank you. Thomas was a good man. We had 10 happy years together before the influenza took him. Sam moved out here from Texas to help me manage after Thomas died, even bought land nearby rather than in town where the businesses were better. He's been a godsend with the children. Lillian cut the biscuit dough into rounds with practiced movements. You have other children besides Alina? Yes, James is 14 and Michael is 9. They're still abed, though they shouldn't be. Boys, Margaret called up the back stairs. Breakfast needs setting up. As they continued preparing the morning meal, Lillian learned more about the boarding house. It housed 8 current boarders, 2 school teachers, a clerk from the land office, an elderly widow, a young married couple waiting for their homestead to be built, and 2 railroad workers. It's a respectable establishment, Margaret emphasized. I run a tight ship. No drinking, no women visitors in the men's rooms, and everyone contributes to the upkeep. By the time the boarders began filing into the dining room, Lillian had helped prepare a substantial breakfast of biscuits, scrambled eggs, bacon, and fried potatoes. She worked alongside Margaret serving the meal, feeling more useful than she had in months. Later that morning, while helping to turn the rooms, Lillian asked about transportation to her land. I'd like to see the cabin, assess what needs doing, she explained as they changed linens in one of the empty rooms. Sam mentioned you might want to go out there, Margaret replied. He left his wagon for you to use, said his ranch hand would come fetch it tomorrow. Lillian paused, a pillowcase in her hands. He did, Margaret smiled knowingly. Sam doesn't make grand gestures, but he notices what people need. It's there behind the boarding house whenever you're ready. After completing the morning chores, Lillian set out for the Rose, formerly Hawkins' property. The wagon was indeed waiting, hitched to a steady-looking bay mare. A bundle sat on the seat containing bread, cheese, and apples, along with a canteen of water and a note in a neat, masculine hand. Thought you might need provisions. The cabin key is with Jenkins at the bank. S.B. Touched by his thoughtfulness, Lillian collected the key from Mr. Jenkins, who handed over the deed to her land as well, explaining that Samuel had completed the transaction that morning before leaving town. The ride to the property took nearly an hour, the wagon jolting over the rutted road that led away from Denver's growing sprawl and into the surrounding countryside. When Lillian finally turned onto the narrow track that led to the southeast corner of what had been her family's farm, emotion threatened to overwhelm her. The small cabin came into view first, a simple one-room structure her father had built when they first arrived in Colorado Territory 15 years earlier. The family had lived in it while constructing the main farmhouse, and later used it for storage and occasionally to house hired help during harvest. Beyond the cabin lay the orchard, just a dozen apple trees, half of them past their prime and at the far edge of the property, surrounded by a whitewashed fence, the small family cemetery where both her parents now rested. Lillian set the brake and climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady as memories flooded back. She approached the cabin slowly, key clutched in her hand. The door creaked as she unlocked and pushed it open, dust motes dancing in the sunlight that streamed through the small window. Inside, everything was much as she remembered: a small iron stove in one corner, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed frame with no mattress, and shelves built into the wall. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams, and a thin layer of dust covered every surface, but the structure itself appeared sound. Lillian spent the afternoon cleaning, using water from the nearby creek and supplies she found in a cupboard. She swept the floor, washed the windows, and aired out the single room as best she could. The physical labor felt good after months of uncertainty, giving her mind something concrete to focus on besides her grief and financial worries. When she finally paused to eat the food Samuel had provided, sitting on the cabin's small porch, Lillian found herself thinking about the enigmatic cowboy who had so unexpectedly altered her circumstances. There had been no ulterior motive evident in his behavior, no suggestion of impropriety or expectation of return beyond the loan repayment they'd formalized. Just kindness offered when she needed it most. As the sun began its descent, Lillian reluctantly packed up to return to town. She would need supplies: a mattress, linens, food, cooking utensils before she could live in the cabin. But for the first time in months, she had a plan and a purpose. Lillian visited the cemetery before leaving, kneeling between her parents' graves to pull weeds that had begun to encroach on the stones. "I kept it," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "Not how I expected to, but I kept our place." The following days established a routine. Lillian worked mornings at the boarding house, helping Margaret with breakfast and room turning. Afternoons she spent making the cabin habitable, using the wagon Samuel had arranged for her until she could afford transportation of her own. Word of her situation had spread through Denver's close-knit community, and offers of assistance came from unexpected quarters. Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile contributed an old but serviceable mattress. Reverend Phillips and his wife provided dishes and cooking pots they no longer needed. Margaret insisted Lillian take linens from the boarding house's extras. A week after the auction, Lillian was ready to move into the cabin permanently. She'd found work 3 days a week at the seamstress shop in town, where her skilled needlework had impressed Mrs. Chen, the owner. The wages wouldn't make her wealthy, but combined with plans to revive the small orchard and perhaps keep chickens, she believed she could make the loan payments to Samuel and eventually achieve true independence. Samuel himself had not returned to Denver during this time, though he'd sent a brief note with his ranch hand when the man came to retrieve the wagon. "Miss Rose hoped the cabin suits. Will check on your progress when next in town. Regards, S.B." The brevity of the message had disappointed Lillian more than she cared to admit, even to herself. She'd found herself thinking of the tall cowboy often, remembering the warmth of his coat around her shoulders and the understanding in his eyes when he'd spoken of his own family's loss. On her first official night in the cabin, a knock at the door startled Lillian as she prepared a simple supper. Opening it cautiously, she was surprised to find Samuel Prescott standing on her porch, hat in hand, looking somewhat hesitant. "Mr. Prescott," she said, unable to keep the pleased surprise from her voice. "Miss Rose," he replied with a nod. "I was passing by and thought I'd see how you're settling in." They both knew his ranch lay in the opposite direction, making passing by an obvious fabrication, but Lillian chose not to comment on this. "Please, come in. I was just making supper, nothing fancy, but there's enough to share if you'd like." Samuel ducked his head slightly to enter the low doorway. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," Lillian assured him, suddenly aware of how small the cabin seemed with his tall frame occupying so much of the space. "Consider it small repayment for all your help." Samuel removed his hat, revealing hair that had been recently trimmed. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance, Lillian noticed, wearing a clean shirt beneath his vest and smelling faintly of soap rather than the usual horses and leather. "The place looks good," he commented, glancing around at what she'd accomplished. "Better than good, actually. "You've worked wonders." Lillian smiled, pleased by his approval. "It's amazing what soap, whitewash, and determination can accomplish." She gestured for him to sit at the small table while she returned to the stove, where a pot of beans simmered alongside cornbread baking in a cast iron skillet. The domestic scene struck both of them with its unexpected intimacy, a man and woman sharing a meal in a one-room cabin as evening fell outside. "I hear Mrs. Chen hired you at the seamstress shop," Samuel said as Lillian served the simple meal. "Margaret mentioned you've been keeping busy." "Your sister-in-law has been very kind," Lillian replied, sitting across from him. "Everyone has, really. I didn't expect such generosity from strangers." "Denver folks look after their own," Samuel said, tasting the beans with appreciation. "And you cook as well as you clean." "A woman of many talents, Miss Rose." Lillian felt a blush warm her cheeks at the compliment. "Lillian," she corrected softly. "If I'm to call you Sam, you should call me Lillian." A smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Lillian, then." They ate in comfortable conversation, Samuel sharing news of town and his ranch, Lillian describing her plans for the property. Neither mentioned the unusual circumstances of their acquaintance or the loan that connected them, yet it hovered in the background, an unspoken bond. As Samuel prepared to leave after helping wash the few dishes, he hesitated at the door. "I was thinking," he said, turning his hat in his hands. "My men and I will be clearing some fallen trees next week. We could bring the excess lumber here, help you expand this place a bit. Add a proper bedroom, maybe." Lillian's initial instinct was to refuse, to insist she could manage on her own, but the practical side of her recognized the value of the offer. "I would appreciate that," she said instead. "But only if you'll let me provide meals for your men while they work. And I insist on helping with the building." Samuel chuckled. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Lillian Rose." He settled his hat on his head, tipping it slightly. "I'll be by Tuesday with the lumber and a couple of hands." After he left, Lillian stood in the doorway watching his figure recede into the gathering darkness, a curious mixture of emotions swirling within her. There was gratitude, certainly, but also something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with charity or obligation, and everything to do with the way Samuel Prescott looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice. True to his word, Samuel arrived Tuesday morning with a wagon piled high with lumber, accompanied by two ranch hands, a weathered man in his 50s who introduced himself as Hank, and a younger Mexican man called Miguel. They worked efficiently, following Samuel's directions as they began framing an addition to the rear of the cabin. Lillian labored alongside them, hammering nails, holding boards in place, and fetching tools as needed. By midday, when she called them to the meal she'd prepared, the framework of the new room was taking shape. "You swing a hammer better than most men I know," Hank commented as they ate beneath the shade of an apple tree. "Not many ladies would get their hands dirty like that." "My father believed daughters should know practical skills," Lillian explained. "He taught me carpentry, basic blacksmithing, even how to shoot." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "A woman of surprising depths, I see." "Don't look so shocked, Mr. Prescott," she teased, more relaxed in his company than she'd been before. "Women are capable of more than society generally allows us to demonstrate." "I'm learning that," he replied with a smile that sent an unexpected flutter through Lillian's chest. The work continued for 3 days, with Samuel and his men arriving at dawn and working until dusk. By Friday evening, the addition was complete, a small but proper bedroom with a window overlooking the orchard. They'd even constructed a simple dresser and bed frame from the extra lumber. As the two ranch hands loaded tools into the wagon, Samuel lingered on the porch with Lillian, both of them admiring their handiwork in the fading light. "I can't thank you enough," Lillian said softly. "This is far more than I expected when you offered to help." Samuel shrugged, though he looked pleased by her gratitude. "It's good to have proper rooms. Winter comes hard in these parts." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of Hank and Miguel preparing the wagon for departure. "There's a social at the church next Saturday," Samuel said suddenly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Dancing, food, that sort of thing. I wondered if you might like to attend. With me," he added, a hint of uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. Lillian looked up at him, surprised by the invitation. "Are you asking to court me, Samuel Prescott?" He met her eyes then, a smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "I believe I am, Lillian Rose, if you're amenable." The directness of his response, free from pretense or artifice, warmed her. "I find I am quite amenable," she replied, matching his candor with her own. Relief and pleasure crossed his features. "Good, that's good. I'll call for you around 5 then. I'll be ready." After Samuel and his men departed, Lillian moved her few belongings into the new bedroom, marveling at how much her life had changed in the short weeks since the auction. From standing alone in the rain, watching her family's legacy slip away, to having a home of her own and the possibility of a courtship with a man who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. It was not the future she had envisioned for herself, but as she settled into her bed that night, Lillian acknowledged it might be a better one than she had dared to hope for. The church social marked the beginning of a proper courtship between Lillian and Samuel. Throughout the summer and early fall of 1875, Samuel would ride to Lillian's cabin 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes staying only long enough to share a meal, other times spending the day helping with repairs or improvements to the property. Lillian continued her work at the seamstress shop, gaining a reputation for fine stitching that brought in additional orders for wedding dresses and special occasion garments. She planted a vegetable garden beside the cabin, acquired 6 chickens that provided eggs for eating and selling, and began the process of rejuvenating the small orchard. On Sundays, Samuel would drive her to church in his wagon, an arrangement that prompted knowing smiles from Denver's residents. Their courtship was conducted with proper decorum, but the growing affection between them was evident to anyone who saw them together. In early October, as the aspens turned golden on the mountainsides and the first chill of autumn crept into the air, Samuel invited Lillian to visit his ranch for the first time. "I'd like you to see it," he explained as they walked along the creek that ran through her property. "To know what I'm building, what I hope to achieve." The invitation felt significant, a deepening of their relationship beyond casual courtship. "I'd like that very much," Lillian replied, slipping her hand into his, a liberty they now allowed themselves when alone. The following Saturday, Samuel arrived in his best wagon, freshly painted and lined with blankets against the morning chill. The hour-long journey passed quickly as they talked, Samuel pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his early days in the territory. When they crested the final ridge, Lillian's breath caught at the view before her. Samuel's ranch sprawled across a verdant valley, nestled against the foothills of the Rockies. A creek similar to the one on her land wound through pastures where cattle grazed. The ranch house itself was larger than she'd expected, a substantial log structure with a wide porch and stone chimney, smoke curling lazily from it in the crisp air. "Sam, it's beautiful," she said as he helped her down from the wagon. "It's not fancy," he replied, a hint of pride mixed with uncertainty in his voice, "but it's solid, built to last." As he guided her through the house, Lillian noted the simple, practical furnishings and the surprising touches of comfort: shelves of books, a rocking chair by the hearth, colorful quilts on the beds. It spoke of a man who valued substance over show, who built for permanence rather than impression. "I started with 20 head of cattle in this land," Samuel explained as they stood on the porch later, watching two ranch hands work with horses in a corral. "The house was half this size. Each year I've added a bit more cattle, more land, another room." Lillian heard the unspoken question beneath his words. "You've built something remarkable, Sam." He turned to her then, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "I've been building it for a purpose, Lillian, for a future I wasn't sure I'd find." He took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I find myself hoping that future might include you." The directness of his statement took her breath away. They had been courting for only a few months, yet Lillian knew with certainty that her feelings for Samuel had grown far beyond gratitude or simple affection. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet strength that complemented her own determination. "Are you asking me to marry you, Samuel Prescott?" she asked softly, echoing her words from months earlier on her porch. A smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes and softening his weathered features. "I believe I am, Lillian Rose, if you're amenable." Lillian felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than the despair that had plagued her at their first meeting. "I find I am quite amenable," she whispered, her heart full as Samuel drew her into his arms. Their wedding took place in Denver's small church on a bright November day, with Margaret serving as Lillian's matron of honor and Hank standing up as Samuel's best man. The entire town seemed to attend, the same people who had witnessed Lillian's darkest moment now sharing in her happiness. After a brief honeymoon in Colorado Springs, Lillian moved to the ranch, bringing with her the few possessions she'd accumulated. The 10 acres with her family's cemetery remained in her name, the cabin maintained as a retreat and a memorial to her parents. Winter settled over the Colorado territory, blanketing the ranch in snow and keeping them close to home. Lillian quickly adapted to ranch life, her practical skills and determination serving her well as she learned to manage a household larger than her small cabin. The ranch hands, initially wary of having a woman in their midst, soon came to respect her capable nature and fair treatment. Samuel, for his part, discovered the joy of coming home to a warm house filled with the sense of cooking and the sound of his wife's voice. The ranch had been his purpose for so long, but now it became the foundation for something greater, a marriage of equals, built on mutual respect and deepening love. One evening in late January 1876, as a blizzard raged outside and they sat before the fire in comfortable silence, Samuel working on a piece of tack while Lillian mended a shirt, he looked up suddenly. "I never did ask you something," he said, setting aside his work. Lillian raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "That day at the auction," Samuel began, his expression thoughtful. "Why did you stay out in that rain for so long? Most folks took shelter, but you stood there for hours, soaked to the skin." Lillian's hands stilled in her lap. "Pride partly," she admitted after a moment. "I didn't want anyone to think I couldn't endure whatever came my way." She paused, remembering. "But mostly it was because I was afraid if I left, even for a moment, I'd miss my chance to bid on that last parcel. It was all I had left of them, of my family." Samuel moved to sit beside her on the sofa, taking her hand in his. "And now?" Lillian understood his question. Was she satisfied with how things had turned out, with trading independence for marriage, with the life they were building together? "Now I have a new family," she said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "One I chose rather than was born to, one I'm building rather than losing." She smiled up at him. "I never expected you, Samuel Prescott, never expected that standing in the rain would lead me here." Samuel brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "When I saw you there, refusing to bow to circumstance despite everything, I think I started falling in love with you right then." Lillian reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that sun and wind had etched there. "And when you covered me with your coat without asking anything in return, I think a part of me knew you were different from other men." As the fire crackled and snow continued to fall outside, Samuel leaned down to kiss his wife, marveling at how a simple act of kindness on a rainy day had changed both their lives forever. Spring arrived early in 1876, bringing with it renewed activity on the ranch as calving season began, and preparations for summer grazing occupied everyone's time. Lillian threw herself into ranch life with characteristic determination, learning from Samuel and the hands while adding her own touches to the operation. She started a substantial vegetable garden that would supply not only their household but the bunkhouse as well, reducing their dependence on store-bought goods. Her experience with the orchard on her original property proved valuable as she planted fruit trees near the ranch house, with an eye toward future harvests. Samuel watched his wife's initiatives with pride, often consulting her on decisions regarding the ranch. Their partnership strengthened with each passing month, built on mutual respect and shared goals. In late April, as they celebrated their 6-month anniversary with a picnic beside the creek that ran through their property, Lillian shared news that would change their lives once again. "I believe we'll be welcoming a new ranch hand around Christmas," she said with a smile as they sat on a blanket beneath a cottonwood tree. Samuel looked confused for a moment before understanding dawned in his eyes. "Lillian, are you saying?" She nodded, her eyes bright with happiness. "I'm going to have a baby, Sam." The joy that spread across his face was something Lillian knew she would remember forever. He gathered her in his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. Margaret visited often, bringing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes from her own children. The ranch hands, gruff men unaccustomed to such matters, nonetheless found excuses to build a cradle, carve wooden toys, and construct a rocking chair for the nursery. Lillian continued her regular visits to the family cemetery on her original property, sometimes talking aloud to her parents about her new life and the child that would be born into it. "You would like Samuel," she told her father's headstone one autumn afternoon as golden leaves drifted around her. "He's building something lasting, just as you tried to do." On December 18, 1876, after a long labor attended by Margaret and the local midwife, Lillian gave birth to a son they named Thomas Henry Prescott Thomas after Samuel's brother, and Henry after Lillian's father. Samuel, who had paced anxiously outside the bedroom door throughout the ordeal, wept unashamedly when the midwife placed his son in his arms. "He's perfect," he whispered, looking from the tiny red face to his exhausted but radiant wife. "You're both perfect." Young Thomas thrived under the doting attention of his parents and the extended family of ranch hands who quickly appointed themselves unofficial uncles. By spring, Lillian had adapted to the demands of motherhood while maintaining her involvement in ranch operations, often carrying the baby in a sling as she directed garden planting or conferred with Samuel about cattle sales. Their first year of parenthood coincided with a prosperous period for the ranch. Beef prices held steady, and Samuel's careful breeding program began to show results in the quality of their stock. The additional rooms he built onto the house included a proper office where Lillian kept the ranch books with meticulous precision, her head for figures proving an asset to the business. In the summer of 1878, As Thomas approached his second birthday, Samuel and Lillian traveled to Denver for the annual livestock show, leaving their son in Margaret's capable care. The event had grown in importance as Colorado's cattle industry expanded following statehood in 1876, and Samuel had several prize animals to exhibit. During their stay, they visited the old Hawkins property, now owned by neighbors who had expanded their own farm using the fertile land. Only the southeast corner remained in Lillian's possession, the small cabin and cemetery a reminder of where her journey had begun. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked as they stood by her parents' graves, the afternoon sun warming the well-tended plot. "Giving up the rest of the land?" Lillian considered the question thoughtfully. "I regret that I couldn't keep my father's dream intact," she admitted. "But I understand now that land is just land. It's what you build on it, who you share it with, that's what matters." She looked up at her husband, taking his hand. "I gained far more than I lost that day in the rain." Their visit to Denver included a stop at the bank, where Lillian made the final payment on the loan for her 10 acres. Though Samuel had long since insisted it was unnecessary, she had been determined to fulfill the terms of their original agreement. "It's done," she announced as they left the bank, a sense of satisfaction in her voice. "Paid in full with interest, exactly as we agreed." Samuel shook his head with a smile. "You are the most stubborn woman I've ever known, Lillian Prescott. And yet you love me for it," she replied with confidence. "That I do," he acknowledged, offering his arm as they walked toward the hotel. "That I most certainly do." Upon their return to the ranch, they found Thomas had grown seemingly overnight, with new words and greater independence. Margaret reported he had been asking for Mama and Papa constantly, his face lighting up when they finally appeared. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm as the seasons turned. The ranch prospered under their joint management, gaining a reputation for quality stock and fair dealings. Lillian's vegetable garden expanded into a small commercial operation, supplying produce to Denver merchants. The orchard began bearing fruit, adding another source of income to their diversifying enterprise. In the spring of 1879, Lillian discovered she was expecting their second child. Thomas, now an energetic toddler with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined nature, greeted the news of a sibling with limited comprehension but general enthusiasm. "Baby?" he would ask, patting Lillian's growing stomach with gentle hands, carefully supervised by Samuel. "Yes, little one," Lillian would respond. "Your brother or sister is growing in there." Samuel was even more attentive during this pregnancy, insisting Lillian rest more and hiring additional help for the household, despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of continuing her usual activities. "You managed a pregnancy while establishing yourself on a new ranch," he reminded her when she objected to his fussing. "Let me take care of you this time." Their daughter, Emma Margaret Prescott, arrived in November 1879, with dark hair like her mother's and a strong pair of lungs that announced her presence to the entire household. Thomas approached his new sister with cautious curiosity, declaring her small, but accepting her as part of the family with the adaptability of childhood. Samuel proved himself as adept with a daughter as he had been with his son, cradling Emma with the same tenderness, but with greater confidence born of experience. Watching him rock their daughter to sleep, Lillian often reflected on how different her life had become from the desperate circumstances of that rainy auction day. As the children grew, so did the ranch. By 1883, the Prescott Ranch was one of the most successful operations in the area, employing 15 hands and running several hundred head of cattle. Samuel and Lillian had added modern conveniences to the house a proper kitchen with a pump, large windows that let in abundant light, and even a piano for Emma, who showed early musical talent. Thomas, at 7, was his father's shadow, absorbing knowledge of ranching with the sponge-like capacity of childhood. Emma, nearly 4, divided her time between following her brother and helping her mother, displaying Lillian's determination and Samuel's calm practicality in equal measure. On the 10th anniversary of the day they met, Samuel surprised Lillian with a special gift, the deed to the remaining portions of the original Hawkins farm, which he had quietly purchased from the neighbors over the preceding year. "It's yours again," he told her as they stood on the porch watching Thomas teach Emma to throw a lasso, the coil far too large for her small hands. "All of it, to do with as you see fit." Lillian looked at the document in stunned silence, then up at her husband. "How did you manage this without my knowing?" "I keep the books," Samuel grinned, looking boyish despite the gray beginning to thread through his dark hair. "I have my methods, Mrs. Prescott, and a few friends in town willing to help surprise you." Tears filled Lillian's eyes as the significance of the gift sank in. "I don't know what to say, Sam." He drew her close, his arms as strong and sure as they had been a decade earlier. "You don't need to say anything. Just know that I never forget what matters to you, what makes you who you are." He nodded toward their children, now laughing as the lasso tangled around Thomas's feet. "They should know the whole story of where they come from, your parents' dream, your struggle to keep it, how we began." Lillian leaned against him, watching their children play on land that had come full circle, returning to family ownership through a path she could never have anticipated. "Remember that day?" she asked softly. "How the rain seemed like it would never stop." Samuel nodded, his cheek against her hair. "I remember thinking you were the proudest, most stubborn woman I'd ever seen, standing there soaked to the bone but refusing to leave. And I remember thinking you were either the kindest man in Colorado territory or had questionable motives when you draped that coat around my shoulders," she replied with a smile. Samuel laughed. "And which did I turn out to be?" Lillian turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face with the same tenderness she had shown 1,000 times over their years together. "The kindest man I've ever known. The best husband, father, and partner I could have hoped for." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land that had witnessed both their individual journeys and their shared path, Samuel leaned down to kiss his wife, the same gentle reverence in his touch as when they had been newlyweds. "Thank you," Lillian whispered against his lips. "For what?" he asked, drawing back slightly to look into her eyes. "For seeing something worth saving in a soaking wet woman too proud to seek shelter," she replied. "For covering me with your coat when I needed it most." Samuel smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with genuine happiness. "Best decision I ever made," he said simply. "I gave you my coat that day, but you've had my heart ever since." As they called the children in for supper, the Prescott family gathered in the home they had built together, not just the physical structure, but the bonds of love, respect, and shared purpose that had turned a chance encounter in the rain into a lifetime of joy. And in the years that followed, as their children grew and the ranch flourished, Samuel and Lillian would often recall that rainy auction day as the beginning of something neither had been looking for, but both had desperately needed a love that, like the land they tended, had put down deep roots and flourished through all seasons.